Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, here today with the lovely Barbara once again to talk about the Sigma 35mm f1.2 DNDG lens for the Sony E-mount system. Now this lens is really exciting. It is the first, and at the time I'm filming this, the only 1.2 aperture lens for the Sony E-mount system. Now don't at me with weird off-brand crazy lenses. I'm talking about for the main lens manufacturers, this is the widest aperture autofocus lens currently available. So it's really exciting to see a 1.2 for Sony. So I had to get my hands on it. I rented it through aperturent.com. Check them out in the link below. And I'm here with Barbara today to take some shots, see how it does, give you my first impressions, and kind of go over this lens and see if it's right for you. All right, so first let's talk about the build quality. The first thing I notice is that this lens is really big. It is 2.5 pounds and it is very front heavy. Even on my full frame A7 III, it feels really front heavy. It makes the camera a little bit awkward to hold. I can only imagine it would be really ridiculous on an APS-C body like my A6500. But having said that, Sigma is not slacking. This lens is really well built. It feels really good in the hand. Besides the size and weight, the focus ring has, it's rubberized and it has just the right amount of stiffness in my opinion. It is focused by wire, but I do think that if I were to manual focus in video, for example, I feel confident that I could nail the focus. It also has a manual aperture ring, which I personally have grown to really like. I know some people hate them, some people are indifferent about them, but I typically know what aperture I want to shoot at, so I love being able to just flip it over and have one fewer button to mess with on the back of the camera. Next, it has an autofocus manual focus switch, which I have been surprised recently by some professional lenses that don't have the autofocus manual focus switch. So it is of course nice to see that on here. It also has an autofocus lock button, which some of the Sony G Master lenses have, and I personally don't use them, but I know a lot of people do. So it is nice to see that Sigma included one of those on this lens. Next, it does have the switch to turn off the clicks of the aperture for video shooters if you do want those smooth transitions in exposure without those incremental jumps of thirds of stops. And the aperture ring feels really smooth when you do that. And even when you have the clicks on, the clicks feel really solid, and it's kind of satisfying to switch it over, to switch the aperture and feel those clicks. Finally, it comes with this nice tulip lens hood that is plastic with some rubber, and it feels really sturdy, it feels really good. Besides the weight, I give this lens an A+ on build quality. So in my opinion, it was an interesting choice to make the first 1.2 aperture lens for Sony's E-mount system a 35mm. I personally would have chosen something like a 50 or an 85 because to me those are those portrait lenses that you want those really blurry backgrounds. But a 35 is still within the standard range, although on the wide end. And I think we can get some really good, interesting stuff with a lot of subject separation and some really beautiful backgrounds, some really nice bokeh. So let's test out shooting environmental portraits and some close-up portraits and see just what that 1.2 maximum aperture can do. That's perfect right there. Love it, love it, love it. Nice, right there. Actually, look off that way a little bit. Yeah. Nice. Just within the first few shots I've taken, I'm already pretty impressed with the subject separation from this 1.2 maximum aperture in both environmental portraits where we get more of the background and when I step in and get some closer up just face portraits. Nice right there. Awesome. So far, I'm really impressed with how sharp this lens is. Even at 1.2, I put her on the edge of the frame to see if we lose sharpness at 1.2 as we move our subject, move our focus to the edge of the frame. And when I punch in on her eyes, her face, she is still really sharp. She is tack sharp center frame at 1.2 and still very sharp off to the edge of the frame at 1.2. Drop that right hand right there, perfect. And awesome. So as you can see in some of these shots, at 1.2 we do have some barrel distortion and some vignetting. That straight line across the bottom is a little bit bowed. Really not a big deal, very easily correctable in post. And honestly, from a wide angle, I kind of expect to see that. It looks very natural to me, but if you do want to get rid of it, very easy to get rid of in post. So now I have the sun right behind her to test how this lens does autofocus wise and in terms of flaring and ghosting when shooting directly into the sun. So let's grab some shots and see what we get. So the autofocus in backlit situations is pretty nice, and she honestly looks pretty epic like this. But as soon as I let the sun peek out from behind her head, we get a ton of flaring. We lose all the contrast and it's just blown out and really just a ton of flaring. So it does autofocus really well in backlit situations. It is still nailing her face, nailing the eyes with the eye detect autofocus. But as soon as I let the sun peek out from behind her, we immediately lose all contrast. The flaring is really bad wide open. Shooting towards the sun sometimes can give your photos a lot of character, a lot of really nice flaring, but at 1.2 with that huge front glass element, huge maximum aperture, that is simply not the case with this lens. That's perfect. All right, nice. Yeah, that's good. So getting some 3/4 length portraits, we got some really nice bokeh. They're not those huge bokeh balls. It's not an extremely blurry, creamy background, but on a 35 1.2, we're still getting some really nice bokeh, some really nice results. I do see quite a bit of cat eye bokeh, which is when the bokeh takes on an ovular shape towards the edges. But at this point, every lens I've tested has some amount of cat eye bokeh, and I've just sort of come to expect it. But let's take a step in and get some tighter shots and see what the bokeh looks like when I have even more subject separation. Awesome, right there, right there, right there, perfect, perfect, perfect. And so now that we've stepped in, and just again, 35 is not a focal length that I would normally use for this type of tighter portrait shot. But with that 1.2 maximum aperture, we're getting some really cool bokeh. The bokeh looks really nice, really smooth, and we're getting a lot of it. And that's really exciting out of a 35mm. So now I put the Atomos on the camera to test autofocus. Autofocus is one of the things that a lot of people cite as a reason not to necessarily get third-party lenses, because the autofocus is sometimes not quite as good. I've already had a couple really minor issues, but let's test out the eye detect autofocus. I'm going to have her walk towards me as I hold down the eye detect autofocus button and see if it keeps her in focus through all or most of the time she's walking. All right, and go ahead and start walking. Perfect. Nice, nice. Just like that. Awesome. So I think that test went really well. That green box stayed on her eye the entire time. So far I'm really impressed with the eye detect autofocus between my A7 III and the Sigma 35 1.2. But that was eye detect autofocus in photo mode. Let me go ahead and take a video and see how well it tracks her in video. The A7 III does not do eye detect autofocus when shooting in 4K, so I'm just gonna put that box, the autofocus box, on her face and see how well it tracks as she walks towards the camera. So let's go ahead and do that test. Go about that same distance. And that's perfect right there. And go ahead and walk towards me. Keep coming, perfect. Right there, perfect. Nice. All right. So that looked really good to me, but here's the footage. You be the judge. So as you can see in those pictures, something that is pretty cool about that 1.2 aperture is you can make a bunch of different ugly backgrounds work for your photo needs. If there's a light that works really well on your model, it doesn't really matter what the background is like. But again, it is a 35, so you're not gonna be able to totally destroy the background unless you get uncomfortably close to your model. But still, as far as a 35 goes, the background is almost disappearing, and that can be really good if you don't necessarily have the most beautiful locations to shoot in. You can make pretty much any area work if you've got the right light. Again, drop that shoulder a little bit, kind of like lean in towards me. Yeah, just like that. Nice. So now that we have lost the light, something definitely worth mentioning is you're gonna get some really great low light performance out of a 1.2 aperture. Not only do you get those awesome bokeh balls, the awesome blurry backgrounds, but the low light performance is gonna be killer. So let's take some shots and see what kind of creative low light shots we can get now that we've lost the light. And awesome. So the low light performance you get from a 1.2 aperture lens is really cool. It is nighttime. I just have some of these street lights around us, and I am shooting at 1.2, 1/100th of a second, and ISO 500. That is really impressive to be able to shoot at ISO 500 in essentially nighttime with just some street lights. The images are turning out way cleaner, and the background is nice and blurry. Thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you to our model, Barbara. This lens has been an absolute pleasure to shoot with, but again, it is $1,500 and it is really heavy. After just a couple hours of shooting, my hand is really tired. But I'm really pleased with the results coming out of this lens. This is my very first shoot with it. I have it for 9 more days before I have to send it back. I rented this lens through Aperturent.com. If you're interested in renting lenses, be sure to check them out. I definitely suggest renting lenses before you buy them, especially if they're really expensive lenses. It is a great way to make sure it is worth the investment. Anyway, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.